Well, thank you for that really kind introduction, Antonio. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm having a wonderful time and really enjoying hearing about all the great work that TCD alums and faculty are doing. So I feel really humbled to be joining this stellar group. I hope I live up to expectations, fingers crossed. Uh, so I'm going to be talking to you today about something that has been kind of on the edge of my major research interests for a while, but something that's become very interesting to me. I think pretty much everyone here, I just want to ask for a show of hands, how many of you have come across issues of water quality or water supply in your research? Just raise your hand if that's ever been an issue in what you've been doing. Okay, so a good chunk of you have found that that's an issue. And that is also the case for where I work. And although I've focused an awful lot on community-based forestry and more recently on what happens to smallholder coffee producers in the face of climate change and market volatility and now coffee rust, watershed management is a big deal because you don't have forests and you don't have coffee if you don't have water. And so this is kind of partly a story and partly a research project that I think I will be carrying forward in more depth. Anyone want to give me money to do more? I'm happy to accept it. Okay, so let me see. What happened? I did something wrong. So just to let you know, if you have any burning questions while I'm talking, particularly things of clarification, feel free to raise your hand or, wave it wildly or something so I see you. And then I'm going to try to finish up in 30 minutes so we have a good time for discussion. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through some things that are sometimes complex. So, okay. I don't think any of you are surprised to know that there's a number of challenges faced with sustainable management for forests, watersheds, and in general natural resources in rural areas. And in general, degradation and overexploitation are major challenges in a world where globalization, increasing pressure on natural resources is something that we deal with all the time. Increasing amount of research suggests that effective institutions are really key for the possibility of managing things sustainably. And by institutions, I do not mean organizations. I mean rules in use. The rules, the practices, the norms, the legal frameworks that people actually follow when they are making decisions and interacting with natural resources. But it is very difficult to form effective institutions, and there are certain contexts in particular which seem inimical to the possibility of sustainable management. And one of those contexts is conflicts, particularly conflict over land in which important and scarce resources are held. And this is a challenge that faced a community where I've been working now for over 20 years, since shortly before I began my doctoral research. I'm coming at this from a perspective of institutional analysis, just to give you a little idea. And most recently, I became interested in, as well, in what we can learn from conflict resolution theories and approaches, very practice-based, pragmatic approaches to trying to think about how we can address very thorny, conflict-ridden problems. Actually, John Dane is one of the reasons I was very happy to come to UF, because I'm hoping to work with people who are really in the trenches thinking about these things, because I have a long way to go. And then a broader overarching framework of political ecology, in the sense that I recognize that power differentials and interactions between land rights and the political economy and the ecological foundations of an area all interact in sometimes very complex ways. Okay, so here my overarching question is, under what circumstances is it possible for local populations to manage conflict and move toward sustainable management of their resources. And I'm focusing now on the Montaña Camapara watershed reserve in western Honduras. It's a context in which there is an endangered mountain cloud forest. It has abundant springs. It's the major source of water for its immediate region. It has a strong history of being at the center of conflict over land, and at the same time, these are populations that have been historically marginalized, indigenous, and have had to rely on their own forms of organization, but strongly influenced by the Spanish colonial heritage, for managing resources and making decisions about development. Most of the land has been communal, going back now over 500 years. With the explosion of coffee production, much of the land has been privatized, and many of the communal forests that I originally went to this municipio to study have been converted to private lands and coffee fields. There are 3 municipios that come together on this mountain that provides water to the region. And about 30 years ago now, people began to organize to try to figure out ways to gain access to the water in a more consistent fashion so that they could have reliable sources for potable water. At the same time, actually in the last 15 years, this area has gone from having no electricity, no roads, very limited interaction, at least without some degree of difficulty, with the rest of the nation, to having cell towers, very good connections to the rest of the nation, improved, upgraded roads, and the first TV and the first electric refrigerator hit in 2002. And since then, there have been massive changes, not least of which it's now very easy for people to migrate in and out, and a really rapid change in the way people think about themselves and their relationship to the world. This is where my research site is located in western Honduras. And this is the focal area. The municipios of La Campa, where I've done most of my work and where most of this talk will be focused. The neighboring municipio that used to be part of La Campa and separated in 1994, a very interesting story I won't tell here. And that's San Marcos de Caiquin. And then Santa Cruz, which is considered within Honduras to be the least developed municipio and to have the lowest human development index as judged by the United Nations. And the red triangle is Montaña Camapara, right in the middle, and each of these municipios by historical boundaries share about 1/3 of the mountain. When Caiquin was created as a separate municipio, someone in the capital drew a line without coming to even check what the historical titles were. And the line that this person drew is the upper line there through La Campa. The lower line is the traditional boundary between Caiquin and La Campa. That is a boundary that has been moving back and forth for about 200 years, depending on who can move the stone cairns between the municipios the quickest without it being found out. In 1980, the communities got so mad at each other, they sat down and decided to put in rebar. They hired 2 surveyors, and they had witnesses come in. Every single one was observed by representatives of each of the 3 municipios, and they sunk those rebars in 5 feet and then put concrete over it. So these are now very firm boundary markers that if anyone had come from the capital to check, could have easily found. But that area now is legally in dispute because according to the Honduran national government, that belongs to Caiquin. And Caiquin would be very happy to get taxes and to get that land. And so it's an interesting situation, one that creates insecurity for La Campa. All right, in this context, What would we expect theoretically? Well, since the conflict has actually involved moving border lines and arguing over land, and as it sometimes come to machete blows and shots being fired, I think it qualifies as conflict. And generally, this is expected to impede the emergence of effective institutions. We would also expect that rapid change would make it difficult for institutions to emerge. In the absence of existing institutional arrangements that people respect, we don't usually anticipate that effective arrangements will emerge. And particularly when you have a strong economic incentive to clear the land. And on this mountain, it's considered prime coffee land and has experienced pressure for coffee clearing, particularly in the 1990s. I was there doing my doctoral research and became aware of how many villages depended on the water from Kamapara, an absolutely precious, beautiful mountain. And I saw the clearing, and I figured within 5 years, that mountain would be gone, and with it most of the mountain water and many of the resources on which people depended. To be perfectly frank, I did not expect anything to happen to protect that mountain. Now, almost 20 years later, that mountain is in very good shape, even better than it was when I started my dissertation. And I have found that to be a fascinating process that I did not expect to happen. And that's what I'm going to try to talk to you about today. I'll try to speed up a little bit now that I've set the context. So basically, I'm going to explore under what circumstances, broadly, this happened and how that might, at the very end, I'll address how I think it may or may not be informative for other places. And in this particular context, how did effective institution emerge? How did people overcome conflict, and why has it endured in what continues to be an overarching, very conflict-ridden and contentious situation? The conflict has not gone away. The way people have managed it has been creative and constructive. So just to make sure we're on the same page, what do I mean by institutions as rules and use? It means what you may do, what you must do, or what you must not do in a given situation. It may be formal in terms of something written down and enforced by legal entities such as police, or it can be informal, like norms. Well, we just don't do it that way because we don't think it should be done that way. And they are often based upon shared understanding, but shared understanding does not mean you agree with it or that you even go along with it all the time if you can get away with it. And institutions can change. We're not talking about something stable. In fact, the most enduring institutional arrangements tend to be those that can adapt to change without destroying a whole system. And that in and of itself is a whole area of research that I'm fascinated by. In what circumstances does rapid change not result in environmental degradation? So really quickly, this is an area that has extreme differences in seasonality based on rainfall from about April, May through September. There's a lot of rain, particularly in June and September. And then you may not see any rain again. And this, the top and the bottom picture there are out the door of the house where I was staying. The top one was taken in January and the bottom one was taken in June. Same view, radically different situation. So, when coffee is harvested, which is the greatest pressure upon water in this area, that is at the end of the dry season, the driest time of the year, and that's when the greatest water demand is. So another area of tension is who gets water. The national laws, though, in Honduras are really interesting. As in many places, the national water laws in Honduras are not well enforced. But they do provide a context in which local municipios and groups have the opportunity to self-organize to provide their own water. Indeed, it's a requirement that rural areas do this. That means in Honduras that many rural areas do not have potable water. In La Campa and Caiquin, strangely enough, it means they do. And that is something that I think bears further examination. I'll try to do a little bit of that now. And it's also interesting to note that all cloud forests above 1,800 meters are supposed to be protected. Very few of them really are. But that law is something that people in this area are aware of, and they used it as a way to argue among themselves that they had to protect it because if they didn't, they could get in trouble. So it's really interesting that they were enforcing a law and continue to enforce a law better than the national government is interested in enforcing it because it supports their own interest to protect this resource and water. So what happened? In the 1980s, they had the first efforts to form water committees. These were very grassroots-based efforts because there were villages in the mountains that did not have any reliable source of water. There was seasonal water supply, some springs that were kind of irregular, and a lot of intermittent streams. And so villages themselves tried to find ways to build canals or pipes and bring water from Camapara. The first actual project that had something more than just holes dug in the ground was completed in the early 1990s. And actually 2 projects were completed then to the 2 largest communities in the area. At the same time, coffee began to be a big deal in La Campa, and partly because roads were built. That's related to a law that was passed in Honduras to provide road building subsidies to communities and to municipios that were producing coffee for the first time. Now, what happened was that farmers started clearing areas for coffee right around the reserves, the reservoirs that had been built for these 2 new water projects. And so the communities that had built the water projects were not very happy to have clearings for coffee in the runoff going into their reservoirs. And so they started telling the farmers that they should leave, and guess what? The farmers didn't go. In fact, more farmers moved into the area. So at that same time, communities started requesting a reserve. A long process began of negotiation between the farmers on the mountain, and this was happening on the side of Caiquin. It was also happening on the side of Santa Cruz as well. Each of these municipios had a different trajectory, and I'll explain why in a minute. This focuses mainly on La Campa because they had the most successful process. I'll talk about the others a bit too. Between 1999 and 2002, communities agreed that something had to be done. They reached an agreement whereby they mapped out the area that would become a reserve, and the community water committees worked with the mayors in each of the municipios to resolve the question of what would be done with the farmers. In Santa Cruz, no one moved. In Caiquin, some people moved, but many stayed on the mountain, but they stopped further incursions. In La Campa, 19 families located on the mountain agreed to move off. And the reason that they agreed to move off relates to their connections with the villages. And then a process continued whereby the people ended up fencing the reserve and now protecting it into the present. So why did they leave the land? They were living in the villages. They were part of the villages. They'd actually all participated in building the water systems. They had to deal with their neighbors all the time. They got tired of being presented as the people who wouldn't cooperate. They had other land. And finally, when push came to shove, they said, if you give us something, we'll go. And so these people are not well off, but everyone agreed that over the course of 3 years, they would pay an extra tax to cover at least a symbolic amount to compensate the farmers who moved off. And at the end of 3 years, all of the farmers had received that compensation. And so there was a sense of mutual sacrifice in that no one got away with anything. I interviewed all of the farmers who moved off who were still alive and in the area. And some of the things that they said was, we felt like we had to go along with the water committees, because we wanted peace. We didn't want it to come to blows. And it came very close. One person said, I couldn't stand against all my neighbors, kind of in the sense of I had no ground left to stand on. Morally and ethically, he could no longer feel that he could continue on the land. And one person said, sometimes you just have to do what's best for the community. They did get a little bit of support, technical support from the FAO in the process of mapping the reserve and arranging the water committees. The FAO brought out Agua para Más de 500 años and kind of took credit for the whole thing. I found it really troubling. I guess they didn't have any other successes that year. But on the other hand, they did this nice map that shows where the reserve is that was mapped and protected and fenced, and the areas that all of these communities there are getting almost all of their water just from Camapara. And so what you can see, in fact, is that 3 municipios are getting water from Camapara and all of these villages. So a quick comparison. What does this actually mean? Most of these 3 municipios have a fairly similar life expectancy, some differences in terms of population density, some fairly significant differences in terms of income, but none of them are considered to be high income. But what really is astonishing is that by 2006, less than 20% of the people in La Campa were without potable water. And it is partly related to this strong effort of the water committees to take control of Camapara. But why has it survived? Even in 2006 when I was there, I was like, yeah, right, everyone has a water committee now. How long is this going to last? They're still fighting among each other. They are still without secure tenure rights to the land, and they're still trying to work out ways to make this work. Well, it's a strong motivation if you have only one source of water. And that was true for La Campa. So by 2012, 97% of the population, by my estimate, with the only exclusion of a few households that are quite a ways away from the pipes, were depending on water from Camapara. Interestingly enough, there's a strong water pressure periodically, which means that pipes burst. People have to go without water, and you really realize how important water is when you have none. And then everyone has to work together to get the pipes replaced. Strangely enough, I think that periodic experience of having no water is a very strong motivation for people to continue to work together. They know a couple of times a year that if they aren't able to work together, they will not have water. And there is no National Water Institute that's going to come in and give them a helping hand. They have to do it themselves. And they have designed institutions through time across the last 20 years. No one can go into the reserve unless you have permission. I had to get permission to go in to do forest mensuration. Cattle aren't allowed to go in. Only the people who do maintenance or who are forest guards are allowed to go into the reserve. I think that's really strange in Latin America because the idea of having a strictly protected, no interference reserve is straight out of a Western conservation idea. But they came up with it, jumping ahead a bit, because they said, well, if we won't let people use it, then maybe no one should use it at all. We have to make it a strict reserve because then it's fair to everyone. We kicked out the farmers, then we have to kick out the hunters, we have to kick out the grazers, we have to protect the water and be serious about it. And so they made that rule. No one else made them make it. And then the Water Committee requires that everyone participate in maintenance. If for some reason you can't, then you have to get someone who will do your job, or you have to pay someone to do it. Or if you have a serious illness or problem in the family, then you might be able to get like a temporary exemption. But that is enforced very well, and also true in Kaikin. Everyone is supposed to go to meetings, or you pay a fine. Everyone has to help maintain the fences, or you pay a fine. And then you have to be present at the meetings, and you can pay off things annually or monthly. There are some differences now with over 17 water committees. They have some differences. The ones that have the biggest problems are those who are most lenient in enforcing the rules. There is municipal oversight, and they have hired forest guards, particularly in Kaikin where there's more tension. And in La Campa, they've made arrangements that collaborate with the Honduran Forestry Institute, the Forest Conservation Institute. They also work with an environmental protection unit that has partial funding from the government, but they've worked out the rules in which that happens, and they've hired local guards, and when people are making incursions on water reservoirs, it hasn't stopped, but it gets stopped pretty quickly. And they continue to negotiate with people. They have made a strong program within both Kaikin and La Campa to educate students on the importance of reserve and where the water comes from. The students make signs. They carry them up to the mountain. We're talking about a long walk. It's about 5 hours from one of the major towns to get up there. And everyone goes. And you put the signs on the trees, and students see the reserve where their water comes from. And by the time they're teenagers, they're helping their dads, usually going up and helping with maintenance. And these neat signs you see all over: protect our plants and our animals. And I love this: I am Kamapara, I give you life. Let's just be very blatant about this. The interesting thing theoretically is that without external intervention, a lot of the rules they developed have strong coherence with Ostrom's design principles for sustainable common property maintenance and common pool resource institutions. And I think the one I want to highlight the most is that the rules are designed to fit the local situation. And the other that I think is not paid enough attention to among institutional analysts is that they were not compelled to do this by any external force, and no one interfered with the decisions that they made. Nonetheless, they autonomously decided to call in the FAO. They also worked with Solidaridad, the Spanish development agency, which provided some resources and technical support for them. And they kept control of it, even if afterwards the development agencies took the credit. But the people still had control. I think that it's not too much to say that there was a strong ethical and moral component to the arguments that developed around the reserve. I've already talked about some of this, but there is this strong idea that water is life and water is a human right, and I think part of that actually came from the dialogue from development agencies and the Peace Corps, which has had a strong presence in this part of Honduras because it's tended to be very safe. So they can send a lot of Peace Corps agents out there, and they tend to make really good, they've been really good in this area, just great people, and everyone loves them, and they listen to them, and they do a lot of hard work for nothing, and there's nothing like that to get admiration of the local population. They have, they consider it really morally reprehensible to deny anyone access to water. You do that, you're just like scum of the earth. And because of that, they continue to make arrangements with villages outside of La Campa and Kaikin to allow them to access Kamapara if they do the work. And that is one of the threats that they face: increasing demands and willingness to share their water, basically at the cost of labor. There aren't many places in the world where water is still basically free for the price of the labor that you do and the maintenance that needs to be done on the system. And then another factor is that people have very dense social networks. Despite conflicts that are ongoing, it's kind of like you're part of the same family, and sometimes the worst conflicts are among the people that you're closest to, right? So you have ongoing conflicts, but they're people with whom you share land, with whom you share values, with whom you share a lot of commonality. So there are many ongoing challenges. I think I've alluded to most of these. There still are farmers in the reserve on the Kaikin side. They have no alternative land, and the people there have not been willing to pay the farmers to move off. So there's been a different approach to trying to deal with the problem. There's been an influx of new landowners from outside the area, particularly in Kaikin, so that means they don't share the same values. And there's growing demands for water, and coffee is already managed. So very quickly, I'm going to skip to the last slide. I think I've made the main points. I don't think that Montaña Camapara is typical. I don't think that the situation is broadly generalizable. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. But I think if you have places with strong local capacity for collective action and self-governance, if you have control over the land, and if you have a basis upon which trust can be built, then perhaps these kind of arrangements can be successful. But really, I think that successful water management needs institutions that are designed for the local situation. They have to be specific. They have to accommodate the variability that exists. There are no panaceas. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions, and I welcome comments, critiques, and challenges. I'm still working on this too. Thanks.